Tucked away in the tranquil landscapes of Hopewell, New Jersey, is a homestead steeped in history. This was home to John Hart, a name perhaps less universally recognized than some, but whose courage significantly contributed to the very foundation of a nation.
Welcome to the historic John Hart Homestead right here in Hopewell, New Jersey. This very ground was once walked by John Hart, one of the brave signers of the Declaration of Independence. Through this video tour, we'll explore the homestead and interweave fascinating and often overlooked details from John Hart's life. While he might be one of the lesser-known signers, John Hart's story is undeniably vital to the complete understanding of our nation's origins. We are two individuals deeply connected to John Hart's legacy. First, I'm Gregory Monroe, a proud direct descendant of John Hart and representing the descendants of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, or DSDI. Our mission is simple: to ensure the stories of all 56 signers are remembered and accurately told. The DSDI has compiled extensive biographies and resources that illuminate the lives of John Hart and his fellow patriots. I'm eager to share this information with you, aiming not only to narrate his story, but also to address some of the misinformation that unfortunately circulates online, in books, and even in textbooks. Our second presenter is Jim Jeffers, the owner and dedicated caretaker of the Hart Homestead. Jim possesses an unparalleled understanding of this land and the authentic features that echo John Hart's era. But before we delve deeper into the homestead itself, let's establish some crucial background on John Hart based on our most current understanding. While we don't have an exact birth date for John Hart, most historians agree he was likely born around 1713 in Hopewell Township, New Jersey. You might have heard whispers that John and his father were born in Stonington, Connecticut, but we've done some digging. Our thorough review of Stonington town records, even confirmed by the town clerk, clearly shows this isn't true. Recent information passed down through generations of the Temple family to the Ryan family, who lived on the Temple Ryan farm after Hart's ownership, suggests that John was born on the Hopewell Township property. John's namesake, his grandfather, was a carpenter from Newtown, Long Island. His son, Edward Hart, was John's father. Edward was a well-respected man in the community, serving as a justice of the peace, a public assessor, and a farmer. It makes a lot of sense that John was born in Hopewell, especially considering his parents were already living there, and he was baptized at the Presbyterian Church in Maidenhead, which we know today as Lawrenceville, New Jersey. Edward himself moved to Hopewell around 1710 when he was about 20 years old. He married Martha Furman on May 17, 1712, and together they raised their 5 children right there in their New Jersey home. John Hart picked up basic reading, writing, and math skills he needed for his time, but like many men back then, his formal schooling was pretty limited. His spelling wasn't always perfect, but honestly, that was a common thing even among some of his distinguished colleagues in Congress. By all accounts, he was a man of average height, well-built, and striking black hair and light eyes, quite handsome in his younger years. People truly respected him for his solid common sense, his knack for reading, and a sharp mind for business. It wasn't long before he earned the nickname Honest John. John Hart's attention was quickly captured by a young woman known for her incredible beauty, Deborah Scudder. She was the cherished only child of Richard Scudder from the area of Scudder Falls. To court Deborah, John would ride a significant 30-mile round trip on horseback. Their devotion led to marriage in 1739. John and Deborah built a large and thriving family, welcoming 13 children: Sarah, Jesse, Martha, Nathaniel, John, Susan, Mary, Abigail, Edward, Scudder, a daughter who sadly passed away in infancy, Daniel, and finally Deborah, who was born when Deborah was 44 years old. Deborah's family also had deep roots in early America. Her great-grandfather, John Scudder, arrived in Salem, Massachusetts aboard the ship James in 1635. With his brothers, Thomas and Henry John Scudder traveled from Salem to Southold, Long Island in 1651, then to Huntington in 1657, and ultimately to Newtown in 1660, where he becomes a prominent and influential figure in town affairs. While John Hart's indelible mark on history is undoubtedly his role as signer of the Declaration of Independence, his roots ran deep into families who were also instrumental in the early days of the colonies. His father, as we mentioned, was Edward Hart, and his mother was Martha Furman. Martha's great-grandfather, John Furman, was part of the Winthrop fleet, marking an initial arrival of their family to these shores. John Furman's wife was Susan Warren, further connecting him to early colonial families. Over his remarkable 29 years of dedicated public service starting in 1750, John Hart logged countless miles on his thoroughbred stallion, Northumberland, and a dependable Bully Rock mare, often receiving only meager compensation for his tireless efforts. His ability to sustain his extensive public service was deeply intertwined with his success as a farmer and astute businessman. It was a prosperity that allowed him to continue dedicating himself to the affairs of his community and eventually the burgeoning nation.
In 1740, John Hart really started to put down roots here, acquiring what he called his homestead plantation. That was the significant 193 acres right here in Hopewell Township. Then in 1751, showing his clear entrepreneurial spirit, he and his brother expanded their ventures, purchasing a mill they aptly named Daniel Hart's Mill. By the 1770s, through further strategic acquisitions, he had become the largest landowner in Hopewell, possessing over 600 acres. His business continued to flourish in 1773 when he acquired a substantial mill enterprise in Rocky Hill with his son-in-law, John Hart, who would later bravely serve as a captain in both the militia and the Continental Army. On his thriving plantation, Hart oversaw a considerable number of livestock, including cattle, sheep, swine, horses, and fowl. It's also a stark reminder of the complexities of the era that he owned 4 enslaved individuals. At the same time, his adult children were busy establishing their own lives and families. This very spring here was absolutely vital to the daily operations of the farm. Later, it would become a crucial resource for the Continental Army when they encamped on his land. You can just imagine the sheer number of men and horses relying on the constant source of fresh water. John, being a steadfast supporter of the American cause, readily offered his land all of its resources, even though it came at a significant personal cost. The damage inflicted on the crops and fences by Washington's troops was substantial, far exceeding anything the British or Hessian forces caused. Yet remarkably, he never sought compensation, viewing it as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the burgeoning nation.
To gain a deeper understanding of historical evolution of the buildings here at Hart Homestead, particularly the wagon house, the DSDI commissioned Elric Endersby, an expert in historical architecture, to conduct a thorough research. Elric's detailed report concludes that this structure indeed served as a wagon house. However, his meticulous analysis of the timber framing and construction techniques suggests that the first floor was likely built in the early 1800s after John Hart's ownership of the land. The roof and second floor, on the other hand, appear to have undergone alterations sometime before 1875.
Outside of New Hope, there's a nature reserve, and they have a colonial log house, and it's a, like a little single-story structure, and that's probably what was here. But then this cottage he built as the most formal structure, and it's really based on the architecture you find in the British Isles. You could be, you could be in Ireland in one of these things, which is so cool. This fireplace has been modified a lot, but it was, they were doing open hearth cooking here probably for over 100 years before coal came to this region and they switched over to a different fuel supply. John Hart or anyone from, his era, this is where they would have been looking out onto the land. And so from our perspective now at this time, this is our only real, we're experiencing the view that he had. And I think that's significant for the history of the house and the connection to the land. I'll tell you what's really amazing is if you look out the windows on a moonlit night, when it's a full moon with snow on the ground. And it's really incredible, actually. It takes your breath away. You come in here and you really feel like you're in a time machine. And you've gone back. And that's the part that I really find is sort of the magic of the experience living here. It's incredible, actually. But, the other thing about this is it's kind of a view that, that you don't often really experience in these older structures, where you can really see how massive they are in the stone masonry and the effort it must have taken to actually build something like this. Because, the early pioneers, when they came here, in the beginning, they probably were living in tents and then would transition to perhaps a log house. And then to build a structure like this, which is really very substantial because it's all made out of stone and native stone from right around, this property. And beyond that, they're also, basing the architecture of where they came from. So in this case, this is the type of cottage you would have found anywhere in the British Isles in the same era. And that's probably what it was modeled on. So it's a fascinating artifact from a bygone era, but one that's so significant in the history of our country. So here we are in the main room of the cottage that was originally built by John Hickson, an early colonial pioneer, and later acquired by John Hart and his wife as newlyweds, probably around 1740. And again, what makes this room quite significant from our perspective today are the windows that are behind me, because they really frame the views that John Hart and his relatives would have had during the colonial period, and we today can share the same perspective as well.
My name is Rick Porter, and I'm a cultural resources historian and a volunteer at the Hopewell Museum. I completed a program of research on the Hart property for the museum in response to a request for information that came in from the descendants. Primary source documentation, supported by some secondary sources, indicates that John Hart acquired this property sometime during the middle decades of the 18th century. An architectural analysis places the construction of the two-story, three-bay stone structure I'm standing in front of as occurring sometime during the first half of the 18th century, making it certain that it was in place during Hart's occupation of the property. Hart is known to have expanded this dwelling through the addition of a large frame building to the east of the stone structure. The latter building was demolished during the first decade of the 19th century and replaced by what is now the brick central section of the house as it exists today. Hart's presence on this property is documented by the tax list for Hopewell Township in 1778 and by his will, which was drawn up in April of 1779, a month prior to his death. He left the house and his 193-acre farmstead to his son Nathaniel Hart, but the younger Hart lost the property in a sheriff's sale in 1785, largely a consequence of debts incurred by his father, including debts associated with his providing financial support for the Revolution.
In June of 1778, a pivotal moment in the history of the land occurred when John Hart extended a crucial invitation to the American Army to encamp on his farm. General Washington accepted his generous offer, and for a significant period during the growing season, over 12,000 soldiers set up camp in John Hart's fields, replenishing themselves with the cool, vital water from the springs on the property. It is even believed that Washington and his officers shared dinner at the Hart Homestead on June 23rd. The troops departed on June 24th, and just 4 days later, they engaged and ultimately won the significant Battle of Monmouth. Author Cleon E. Hammond, who became the steward of the Hart Homestead in 1953, eloquently captured his reflections in his book while gazing through the very windows of John Hart's home. He wrote, "To look upon his gently sloping hillside, where the American army once camped, drank from his robust old spring, and trod upon the soil that was his, instilled a sense of identification with Mr. Hart that at times seemed very real. Far from the legend, he was a very human being, moved by the same forces that influence the lives and fortunes of all men. As one becomes acquainted with John Hart, there emerges a capable, personable, ambitious, yet dedicated man, essentially conservative but heroically liberal. In his world, there were pioneers of land, of enterprise, and of political philosophy. From a good but modest beginning, John Hart embodied all three, and his attainments qualify him to be described as a self-made man of his time."
John Hart's commitment to public service began long before the momentous events of 1776. He was first elected to Hunterdon County, New Jersey Board of Chosen Freeholders in 1750, demonstrating the trust his community placed in him early in 1775. He was further elevated when he was elected Justice of the Peace. This appointment carried a significant weight, and he became formally known as John Hart, Esquire. From 1761 to 1771, John Hart diligently represented the counties of Hunterdon, Morris, and Sussex in the colonial assembly, gaining invaluable experience in governance and debate. It was during this period that he first encountered Abraham Clark, who would later become his fellow New Jersey delegate and fellow signer of the Declaration of Independence, forging a bond in a crucible of pre-revolutionary politics. Further underscoring his dedication to public duty, he was appointed to the Court of Common Pleas in 1768, demonstrating his growing influence and legal acumen. By 1774, with tensions escalating dramatically between colonies and Great Britain, John Hart was elected to a crucial committee tasked with the responsibility of electing and adopting delegates to the First Continental Congress and fiercely protesting the contentious Tea Act in 1775. As the colonies moved closer to unified action, he was elected to the New Jersey Committee of Correspondence, a vital network that facilitated crucial communication and coordination among the increasingly united colonies. He also served on the committee of the safety and powerful body formed to act in the public welfare of the colony during recess of Congress, highlighting his commitment to a proactive leadership during a time of crisis. The pivotal year of 1776 marked the turning point in American history and for John Hart's role within it. He was elected to the New Jersey Provincial Congress, a significant step towards self-governance. In the same momentous year, he was entrusted with the considerable responsibility of signing the new Bill of Credit Notes, the very first paper currency issued by the state of New Jersey. Hart personally signed each of these notes, a tangible symbol of the new state's financial autonomy, amounting to a total of 25,000 individual signatures. Then in June of 1776, the people of New Jersey elected him as one of their 5 delegates to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, granting them the authority to vote on a momentous question of independence. His fellow New Jersey delegates, who would also bravely affix their names on the Declaration, were Abraham Clark, Francis Hopkinson, Richard Stockton, and John Witherspoon. Upon arriving in Philadelphia in that crucial month, John Hart stood as a resolute advocate for independence. When the time came to formalize the commitment, John Hart was the 13th delegate to inscribe his name on the historic document, willingly pledging his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor to the cause of liberty. Following the establishment in New Jersey's General Assembly in August 1776 under the newly adopted state's constitution, John soon found it necessary to return home due to pressing family matters. Tragically, his beloved wife Deborah passed away on October 8, 1776, with John by her side, a moment of profound personal loss amidst the turmoil of the Revolution. It's crucial to address a common misconception here. Contrary to some accounts found online, his children were grown at this time. They were not scattered, and were indeed present to see John again before his own passing, surrounding him with love and support in his final days.
Welcome to the Hopewell Museum. It's good to see you.
To gain further insight into John and Deborah Hart's personal lives and the artifacts that remain, we turn to the Hopewell Museum and its dedicated archivist, Bonita Kraft Grant.
These are an accumulation of artifacts relating to John Hart. Many of them were given to the museum over the years. This is a so-called composite portrait of the signer by Charles Edward Waterhouse, who was a famous illustrator. This was commissioned by Colonel Leon Hammond, who occupied for a time what was John Hart's farmstead. We have a bone cufflink of John Hart and the earring and parasol tip of Deborah Scudder Hart, his wife. These were donated by a Pennington attorney who was a descendant of the signer in 1959. And we have John Hart's autograph in a 6-shilling note. We have several of those, along with a framed portrait, which also hangs above the fireplace. This portrait was done by John Hart IV, who was a noted artist in Philadelphia. And we also have, allegedly, John Hart's hair. Later, you will be visiting the Twin Hunt Cemetery, about 3.3 miles southwest of here. John was buried there next to his wife, and he was exhumed in 1865 and moved to the Old School Baptist Cemetery here in town, which you will also be visiting later. It says the reddish hue of the hair was attributed to the soil. We don't know. And according to Cleon Hammond, his biographer, the hair was supposed to be very dark. What is so mysterious about John Hart is that there are very few things that we do know with certainty. We also have a cancellation stamp with his image from, of course, 1976, May 11th, which was the date of his death. And probably our most prized item is a deed which was signed by John Hart with Deborah Scudder Hart's mark and Daniel Hart, who was one of his brothers. This was just recently treated by the Conservation Center in Philadelphia and reframed, and it is in archival dress for the 250th, and we're very pleased to have it. There is on the wall here, John Hart's family tree, so-called. It's very old paper, but if you get really close and have a magnifying glass, you can discern some of his relatives.
We're on our way to the Hunt Cemetery. Bonita managed to get a special permission to access the private property, allowing us to see John Hart's original burial site and where Deborah Hart remains. Here in the tranquil and historic Hunt family burial site lies the original and final resting place of John Hart's beloved wife, Deborah. John Hart himself passed away on Tuesday, May 11, 1779, at the age of 66, following a prolonged and arduous battle with kidney stones. In his final moments, he was surrounded by the comfort and love of his family at their home. Tragically, John Hart's death left behind a significant burden of debt, ultimately forcing the sale of much of his land for a meager sum. While his sons would eventually seek new opportunities and lives away from Hopewell, his daughters remained, their families weaving themselves into the enduring fabric of the surrounding community. Initially, John's grave, nestled beside Deborah's, was marked by simple, unadorned fieldstones, humble markers that could easily be overlooked by time. But then, an act of remarkable foresight occurred. Deacon James Hunt, the landowner at the time, thoughtfully inscribed a significant mark upon John's stone, a deliberate declaration for posterity. Men of future times would want to know the spot where the remains of John Hart rested. Remarkably, in 1865, nearly a century later, the New Jersey legislature recognized the profound significance of Deacon Hunt's inscription. Using it as their invaluable guide, they were able to accurately identify John Hart's remains and respectfully moved his body to the churchyard of the Baptist Meeting House in Hopewell, erecting a monument more befitting his enduring legacy. Yet Deborah's exact site was not determined, so John's beloved wife, Deborah, remains here, resting peacefully in the quiet earth of her original burial place. A captivating local legend woven into the very fabric of this region's history tells the dramatic tale of John Hart seeking refuge deep within the rugged embrace of the Sourland Mountains during the tumultuous years of the Revolutionary War. This compelling narrative has been passed down through generations, vividly painting a picture of a man on the run, navigating the challenging terrain of the Sourlands. While John Hart was undeniably a pivotal figure in the American Revolution, and the secluded and strategically advantageous Sourland Mountains would have indeed offered a plausible sanctuary, it's important to note that no concrete historical evidence has emerged to definitely substantiate this specific claim. Historical accounts do firmly establish that John Hart was indeed compelled to flee his home due to his unwavering political beliefs and the actions he took in support of the revolutionary cause. The remoteness and formidable terrain of the Sourland Mountains would have certainly made them a logical hiding place for someone seeking to evade capture. However, despite the enduring nature of these unsupported stories and cherished local legends, no documented evidence such as personal letters, diary entries, or official records from the time has been discovered to definitely confirm Hart's presence in those mountains. Following the strategic British withdrawal from this area after the crucial American victories at Trenton and Princeton, Hart was able to safely return to his beloved home. His decision to seek refuge was primarily motivated by a deep concern of safety and well-being of his friends and family, seeking to shield them from potential repercussions at the hands of the British forces. Walking down this path in beautiful Hopewell to see my sixth great-grandfather always gives me a sense of pride. We are at the Hopewell Old School Baptist Meeting House. On July 3, 2006, our organization, the descendants of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, had the distinct honor of dedicating a lasting bronze plaque to the memory of John Hart and his wife, Deborah Scudder. Many descendants of John and Deborah's gathered at the Baptist Meeting House on Broad Street in Hopewell, New Jersey, for this meaningful dedication. It is particularly fitting that John now rests and is honored on the very land that he generously donated to the Baptist community. In a demonstration of his characteristic generosity and community spirit, John Hart in 1747 donated a portion of his land, specifically known as the Lower Meadow, to the local Baptists for the construction of their church and this very cemetery. While John Hart himself was never formally a member of the Hopewell Baptist Meeting House, His significant act of generosity led many in the community to believe that he was. The prominent obelisk marking John Hart's grave unfortunately contains a historical inaccuracy, incorrectly stating his year of death as 1780. However, the overwhelming census among most biographers and contemporary accounts, such as those published in the New Jersey Gazette, firmly places his death on May 11, 1779. Further corroborating his date, John's last will and testament was dated April 16, 1779, just weeks before the generally accepted date of his passing. On May 19, 1779, the New Jersey Gazette reported, on Tuesday the 11th instant departed this life at his seat in Hopewell, John Hart, Esquire, the representative in General Assembly for the County of Hunterdon, and late Speaker of that House. He had served in the Assembly for many years under the former government, taken in an early and active part in the present revolution, and continued to the day he was seized, with his last illness, to discharge his duties of a faithful and upright patriot in the service of the country and general and the country that he represented. The universal approbation of his character and conduct among the ranks of people is the best testimony of his worth, and as it must make his death regretted and lamented, will ensure lasting respect into his memory. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, described John Hart as a plain, honest, well-meaning Jersey farmer with little education, but with good sense and virtue enough to pursue the true interests of his country. It is our sincere hope that this journey through John Hart's life and legacy has illuminated his true story and helped to dispel some of the inaccuracies that unfortunately continue to circulate. While we have diligently strived for accuracy in presenting his narrative, we also recognize that the genealogical and historical research is ongoing and evolving endeavor. There may still be more layers to uncover and further details to emerge about John Hart's remarkable life. The pursuit of historical knowledge, particularly in the intricate field of genealogy, is a continuous process, one that rarely yields a truly complete picture, but one that is always worth undertaking.